Hello and welcome to It's interview powerful conversation to inspire. I'm Leo and I'm joined today by Luke Trower, the designer at Purple Go Agency, the world's only disability focused marketing agency looking to increase reputation of disabled people in advertising and media, empowering the disabled community to be involved in decision making as to how the community is represented. Luke's role focuses on inclusive graphic design. So thanks, Luke, for joining me. I'm interested how you create graphics that are accessible for the disabled community.
So that's a good question to start with, Leo. So basically, a lot of what my work is involved with actually centers around that question in the broadest sense, because a lot of the time there is no guideline for how to design graphics inclusively. So a lot of the background of what I do is I knew that there were guidelines and best practices for things like web design and product design, and people were building out accessibility guidelines there. And it got me thinking about graphic design specifically, because I was, at the time, I was involved in the disabled community, in my local disabled community at uni, and I was just starting to ask questions because I was doing graphic design degree, and it just went together quite naturally, those questions. And when I looked into it, I found that there weren't actually any solid guidelines for designing graphics inclusively, as we would expect from things like WCAG in web applications and things. So when it comes to that question of how do we design graphics, or how do I design graphics that are inclusive and accessible for disabled people, that really is the question that I'm asking as well a lot of the time. Because I think for me, what makes graphic design different to some of the other disciplines where we've worked out accessibility features more thoroughly is that a lot of those are a lot more straightforward, I think, sometimes. Graphic design, there's always that toss up as to, is graphic design art as well? And I think that because of that artistic influence that maybe other disciplines don't have as much, we have to ask questions about how, if this is an art form, then how much do decorative considerations play a factor into graphic design versus what we would perhaps expect from other disciplines? And is there a way for us to keep some of those decorative things that we like and that are seen as good design in graphic design while being accessible at the same time? And I think that's really the basis of where everything that's where everything comes from and stems from, is how do we harmonize those two? Because if you can find out that key, I think that's key to finding out how to design graphics that are accessible and inclusive for the disabled community. So a lot of the time, a lot of what I do is based around, where it can be, is based around the basics from WCAG and things like that. Things that, I mean, everyone at Purple Goat's probably sick of me talking about color contrast now. I don't stop talking about color contrast. That's probably, so, I mean, that's one thing, that obviously color is a huge part of graphic design and also a part of web design. There are very clear guidelines that we can use as graphic designers from WCAG. There are great web resources that we can use to compare hex codes and figure out if things meet compliance and things like that. And that's one quite easy way we can implement that. There are other ways as well, things like when we think about fonts, the old in the accessible community, there's always the saying of using sans serif fonts, which are the ones without little flicks and fancy bits on the edges. Those are considered more accessible. So again, that's something that as a graphic designer, I can bring over quite easily. But then beyond that, when it gets to more advanced or specific things involved with graphic design, that's where some of those really clear and quite straightforward examples start to break down. So, for instance, a lot of my job is based around designing pitch decks that we pitch to clients. I work with the strategist, she does the text, and I'll do the design that goes with it. Now, one question there is, how do we make a slide deck accessible? Because a lot of the time we are working with tools that may not have all of the accessibility features that we have come and accepted and that are really good in other programs. We might not have, and there might, some of the particular nuances of that particular form of graphics might also bring up certain accessibility questions. Like if I'm working with a brand, if I'm working on a deck for a particular brand, sometimes when we pitch to specific brands, we like to make the deck within their colors to show that we understand them. Well, what if we're using a brand and their colors are a gradient? What does, color contrast works really well for when you're considering flat colors on flat colors, because that's what you're probably going to do on a website. But a graphic designer might have, more like to have a gradient background, or even beyond that. What if the background's got like dots on it or lines in the background? If it's checkered, what does that mean? Does that mean, is that inaccessible? Is that accessible? It becomes a lot less clear. And so my rule that I always like to implement when I'm making these sorts of considerations is I like to try and be, I like to try and use, I think sometimes we have to use common sense, and we have to use the approach that makes the most sense with the information that we have and with other guidelines that are similar. So if I go back to that example I just gave about gradients and things, now I know that one way of judging whether gradients are accessible or not is whether or not you take the point where the two colors would have the lowest contrast and you can compare them. And then if they pass accessibility wise, then it means that in theory, the color contrast should work for all the other colors involved between the text and the gradient background. And while that's not a perfect solution, it is one that works within the sense of the thing that we're designing for. And I think that's the other thing as well. Quite often we need to think about what is the purpose for the thing that we're designing for. If we're designing something that is very decorative, something very artistic, then visual clarity is quite important. However, if I'm doing something quite text heavy, like a slide deck, sometimes they can have paragraphs of text on one slide, then I need to make sure that what's most important there is the color contrast, because of making sure that the people who are going to be taking information from that slide deck are able to do so. And beyond that as well, I think sometimes we have to think, as well as thinking about what we need to do in those cases as well, it's mostly about thinking about purpose and thinking about how things come about, why things are being created, who they're being created for, and also on top of that, thinking about ways that we can make things accessible in different ways. So one thing that I believe quite a lot, particularly when it comes to inclusive graphic design, is that one solution can't be inclusive for everyone, because sometimes we have accessibility requirements that may sometimes overlap, or that maybe it ends to each other. So in those cases, what I like to try and do as well is give people the flexibility to be able to interpret the graphic in a way that's good and that's accessible and legible for them. So for instance, if we're doing something, a great example of that, again, going back to color contrast. Color contrast is a good thing for people in the visually impaired community, because if you have colors that are too close together, they may not be able to read the text as well. However, in other communities like the neurodivergent community, if we have too much color contrast, that can be quite overwhelming. So pure white on pure black can be a quite stark contrast. The one example I always like to give for that is the disability pride flag, how they changed that from being very bold, saturated colors with zigzags to being a much more paler, more muted, less saturated colors put together. And that meant that it could represent the community better. But in those cases, I think that one thing that we can do is that, because these different things, in that particular case with color contrast, is there a way that people could change the text or the background so that it worked? Maybe some people prefer to read text in a specific color. Maybe black isn't the way that they find easiest for reading.
That's amazing. And I think a lot of the organization and company, when they are designing and marketing material, I probably don't always think about these things today. So, my next question is, what inspires you?
So I think what inspires me is, when I think about this sort of question as to what inspires me, I think there isn't one particular overarching thing that inspires me. I think it's a collection of things brought together, and ideas and things that I've seen that collectively lead me to make the decisions that I think are good and right based on what I've seen. So for instance, when it comes to what inspires me about inclusive graphic design, I mean, it's hard to find sources of inspiration for that as much. Like if we think about, I'd call it non-inclusive graphic design, you could find, or design that's not specifically tailored around the disabled community, we could think about, there are lots of different pages and sources in which you can find graphics that can inspire you, and those work on a visual level, but they may not work for what I'm doing, because I have to think about inclusivity considerations as well. So I think for me, what inspires me is reading from a lot of different sources and being able to find out and learn and use new pieces of knowledge about inclusivity and accessibility guidelines in order to inform my next decision. So one thing you said there, Leo, which I wanted to pick up on a little bit, was how you said about how marketeers, they don't often perhaps think about inclusivity requirements in their advertising and media as much as they should do. And I would absolutely agree with that. Something that I'm very much a believer in is that a lot of the reason why people don't make these considerations in the first place is because there's a lack of education around inclusivity requirements within the graphic design community. And so people aren't making the considerations because a lot of the time people probably don't even know they exist. And so I remember what inspired me to start learning about that and to keep on going was very much those little pieces of information I could find on different forums, websites, LinkedIn, books, and piecing all of those things together for myself in order to create and in order to create things that would hopefully then inspire others to make their own inclusive graphics.
Interesting. I think the more awareness that is from people like yourself, hopefully, the more mainstream it will become to consider the aesthetics. So my next question is, what difference would you like to see or make in the world?
So I think the difference that I would like to make in the world, developing on that last point I made, would be I would like for there to be a source of information or guidance for graphic designers to be able to start to make those inclusivity considerations and requirements. Because as I said, when I was learning, that didn't exist. And to my knowledge right now, that still doesn't exist. It's still something that's not really talked about in the graphic design community. And I think if we as accessibility experts are able to put that knowledge into that space and give that community the understanding of how graphics could be more inclusive, I think they would be willing to adopt that. I think that if the tools were given to designers, I think they would try and adopt them. And I think how that comes about, honestly, I've still got some time and some figuring out to do before I feel like I can be an authority of that. I'm still learning as well. It's a fine balancing act a lot of the time, and things can change depending, from day to day and week to week in terms of how I approach different problems. And I think whatever comes out of this and how in the end things become inclusive and more accessible, I think it needs to give designers the flexibility to still be able to exercise creativity and thought and all of the things that they've enjoyed, all those things that they've enjoyed, and that draw people to, I guess, what we call non-inclusive graphic design, and give people that ability to harmonize the two things. That's really what I'd like to see. Because one thing that I'm very much a believer of as well is I feel like sometimes when we think of inclusive graphic design, we think it looks bad, that if we're following all the rules, that if you're using your color contrast and your fonts, it's going to look ugly and bad design. Well, why does that have to be the case? One thing that I'm doing a lot in my personal work at the moment is I'm just starting to look into the idea of accessible fonts. Like on my Instagram right now, I've just started a thing, I call it Project Comic Sans. The reason behind that is because we think of Comic Sans as this horrible, ugly, terrible font that shouldn't be used, but actually it's quite an accessible font, and a lot of people within the disabled community find it provides good legibility for them. And so so a lot of what I'm thinking is at the moment with that and the work that I'm posting is, how can we recontextualize things that we may think don't look good or that aren't good design, and is there another way that we can present them to make them better, like look nicer? A lot of I think of it almost like a piece of food in a way. Like if we think of like a potato, say, we don't like, you just bite into a raw potato, that's going to taste horrible because it's just a raw potato. But you boil it, you can fry it, cook it, you've got chips, crisps, jacket potatoes. If you add some considerations in there and think about different ways of working with it, it can become something very delicious and appealing. And I kind of think of that's kind of what I'm kind of trying to do with Comic Sans right now, is look at, well, what are the ways we've explored using that font? And are there actually other ways that we might not have explored using that font to make it appealing again, to make it into something that people want to use, so that we have these accessible, these accessibility and inclusivity tools and that they're not all thought of as bad design. Is there a way that we can change that narrative?
Yeah, to me, it sounds like not only are you sort of developing the accessibility of design, but you're also kind of shifting the mindset of people who may think that accessible design would be kind of bland or not as interactive. So it's a really interesting dynamic to think about. Great. Well, we had to do it in so thank you very much for joining me, Luke. Where and how can people connect with you?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on, Leo. It's been a pleasure. If people want to follow me, I'd say the best place is on Instagram, at Luke Purple Goat, no spaces, no underscores or anything, just all one long word. If you want to see more broadly the collective of work, I would say follow Purple Goat Agency on Instagram as well. That's who I work for. Again, no spaces, just all one word. And you can see some of the wider work we're doing as well, even beyond I sometimes talk about inclusive graphic design there, but there are other things that other members of the team that are doing to explore new spaces as well. So if you're more interested on a wider level, go there as well.
Great, okay. And what I do is I will share all the link to your social media, Purple Goat Agency, social media, and website within this. So thanks again, and thanks everybody who watched this and enters into this. Will be back with another powerful conversation. Bye for now.
Remember to follow, subscribe, and like.